The courtroom was a tomb. For 3 hours, Danielle Brooks had dismantled a criminal empire, one ledger at a time. She was the FBI, golden goose, the only person alive who knew where the bodies were buried and whose pockets were lined with De Luca's blood money. The prosecutor leaned in, his voice a sharp whisper. "Ms. Brooks," who gave the order. Danielle took a breath. The feds had promised her he was gone. They told her Alessandro De Luca had fled the country, a coward running from a life sentence. She opened her mouth to speak the name that would end it all. But the name died in her throat. At the back of the room, the heavy wooden doors didn't just open. They felt like they were torn back by the sheer weight of a presence. The sunlight from the hallway cut a sharp silhouette against the marble floor. It wasn't a federal agent. It wasn't a late juror. Alessandro De Luca didn't just walk into a courtroom. He walked into his own execution. And he was smiling. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be a memory. But as he slid into the defense table beside his attorneys and locked eyes with the woman who betrayed him, Danielle realized the terrifying truth. The trial hadn't even started yet. Before she was a marked woman, Danielle Brooks lived a life defined by the cold, comforting logic of numbers. As an elite forensic accountant, she existed in the quiet spaces between spreadsheets and tax codes, possessed of a rare talent for seeing the stories that data tried to hide. To her colleagues, she was a ghost in the office, meticulous, invisible, and far too focused to be bothered with the messy politics of the outside world. She believed that as long as the math balanced, the world made sense. But in the autumn of 2025, Danielle found a decimal point that shouldn't have existed, and the logic of her world began to fracture. It started with a routine audit of a mid-sized construction firm, a company that seemed unremarkable on paper. Most auditors would have skimmed past the miscellaneous vendor payments, but Danielle had a gift for spotting patterns. She noticed a series of $3 million transfers routed through a shell company with an address that traced back to a vacant lot in Cicero. Her curiosity, usually her greatest professional asset, became her most dangerous liability. She didn't just flag the error. She followed the digital breadcrumbs, peeling back layer after layer of encrypted firewalls until she breached a hidden server. She didn't find just another case of corporate embezzlement. What she found was the death ledger. It was a digital masterpiece of corruption, a secondary set of books that tracked the true cost of doing business in Chicago. It wasn't just numbers. It was a map of a city's soul being sold. Names of high-ranking police captains, prominent judges, and key city officials were meticulously cataloged next to recurring consultation fees. It was a payroll for the Untouchable, a list of everyone the organization had bought and paid for to ensure the law never knocked on the wrong door. But as her eyes scanned the bottom of the ledger, the air in her small office seemed to vanish. There was a final section titled Acquisitions. It wasn't a list of equipment or property. It was a list of names, dates, and locations. Danielle realized with a sickening jolt that she wasn't looking at financial records, she was looking at a schedule of hits. She saw the name of a local journalist who had gone missing 3 weeks prior, followed by a timestamp and a final payment confirmation. At the top of every single page sat a recurring set of initials, ADL. In that moment, Danielle wasn't just an accountant anymore. She was a witness to a massacre. She had accidentally stolen the keys to Alessandro De Luca's kingdom, and for the first time in her life, the numbers didn't just fail to balance, they screamed. She had set out to find a missing decimal point, but instead, she had found the heartbeat of a monster. She didn't know it yet, but the moment she hit download, she ceased being a private citizen and became the most hunted woman in the state. The moment Danielle handed over the encrypted drive to the FBI, the air in the small, windowless interrogation room changed. The lead agent didn't look relieved. He looked terrified. They had spent a decade trying to map the nervous system of Alessandro De Luca's empire, but Danielle had handed them the brain. She was no longer just a witness to a murder. She was a walking extinction event for the Chicago underworld. Within the hour, the chatter on the encrypted dark web forums was deafening. The word was out. The ghost ledger had been breached, and the woman who held the key was still out in the open. Before the ink was dry on her protective custody forms, De Luca had issued a decree that reverberated through every back alley and high-rise in the city. $10 million, dead or alive, but preferably dead, before she could reach a secure facility. The extraction was supposed to be simple. A nondescript black sedan, an unmarked route, and a safe house 4 hours outside the city. But as Danielle sat in the back of the car, watching the familiar skyline of Chicago blur into the dusk, a cold realization began to crawl up her spine. She wasn't an agent, but she was a master of details, and the details of her driver were beginning to feel wrong. He hadn't spoken a word since she entered the vehicle. He hadn't checked the rearview mirror to look at her, not even once. Instead, his eyes were glued to a small, flickering tablet mounted to the dashboard. Every few seconds, a notification would ping. It wasn't a GPS update. It was a countdown. Danielle looked at the driver's hands. They were covered in fine, expensive leather gloves, yet he gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity that didn't match the empty highway ahead. Then, she saw it, the subtle glint of a notification on the dashboard screen that hadn't been cleared. It was a photo of her own face, taken from her office security badge with a single word underneath: confirmed. The quiet of the car became suffocating. They weren't being chased by sirens or gunmen in black SUVs. The threat was already inside the metal box with her. She watched the speedometer. 60 miles per hour. 65. They were passing the last exit before the bridge, a point of no return where the marshals were supposed to meet them. The driver's right hand slowly left the wheel, drifting toward the gap between the center console and his seat. It was a slow, deliberate movement, the kind of motion a hunter makes when he doesn't want to startle the prey. Danielle's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed loud enough to fill the cabin. She knew if she screamed, it was over. If she reached for the door, he would lock it. She leaned forward, her voice a trembling whisper that she forced into a tone of mundane curiosity. "Excuse me, I think we missed the turnoff for the service station. I really need to stop." The driver didn't turn his head. His hand paused, hovering just inches from the grip of a suppressed pistol. "The order's changed, Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice as flat and emotionless as a dial tone. "We're taking a more private route." In that split second, Danielle didn't think. She acted on the raw, jagged edge of survival. She didn't reach for the door. She reached for the steering wheel. With every ounce of weight in her small frame, she yanked the wheel hard to the right toward the gravel shoulder. The car lurched, tires screaming as they lost grip on the asphalt. The driver's hand went for the weapon, but the sudden centrifugal force threw him against the door. The sedan spun, a chaotic whirl of metal and glass, before slamming into a dense thicket of trees at the edge of the embankment. Silence returned, heavier than before. Through the smoke of the deployed airbags, Danielle saw the driver slumped over, dazed but breathing. She didn't wait for him to wake up. She scrambled out of the shattered rear window and disappeared into the tree line, the sound of her own gasping breath the only thing marking her escape. Behind her, the tablet on the dashboard pinged one final time. The bounty was still active, and the sun was finally going down. To understand why the city held its breath when Danielle disappeared into the woods, one had to understand the man she was running from. Alessandro De Luca was not the kind of monster who hid in the sewers or barked orders from a smoke-filled backroom. In the eyes of the public, he was Chicago's favorite son, a pillar of the community whose name was etched in gold leaf above the entrances of children's hospitals and public libraries. He was a man of impeccable tailoring and soft-spoken grace, a billionaire philanthropist who seemed to spend more time at charity galas than in boardrooms. To the single mothers in the South Side, he was the saint of the streets, the man who quietly paid for winter coats and grocery bills when the city's bureaucracy failed them. He was a myth wrapped in a silk suit, a ghost who walked in the midday sun. There were no mugshots of Alessandro De Luca. There were only photographs of him shaking hands with governors or kissing the cheeks of grandmothers at the Feast of San Gennaro. He didn't use profanity, he didn't display wealth with gaudy jewelry, and he certainly didn't get his hands dirty. If a rival disappeared or a union leader was found in the foundation of a new stadium, De Luca was always miles away, hosting a fundraiser for the arts or attending a quiet mass at the cathedral. He was a master of the clean break, an architectural genius of crime who built walls so thick between himself and the violence of his underlings that even the FBI couldn't find a crack to peer through. The genius of his power lay in his civility. While other bosses ruled through fear, De Luca ruled through gratitude. He made himself indispensable. He bought the loyalty of the precinct not with bribes, but with new equipment for the officers' children's baseball teams. He didn't threaten the local journalists. He invited them to exclusive dinners and spoke passionately about his vision for a unified Chicago. This created a terrifying moral vacuum for anyone trying to take him down. When the feds whispered that he was a murderer, the people pointed to the new community center. When they claimed he was a racketeer, the politicians pointed to the thousands of jobs his construction firms provided. This was the man Danielle Brooks was about to denounce. As she huddled in the dark, miles from safety, she wasn't just fighting a criminal, she was fighting a god of the city's own making. The ghost of Chicago wasn't a shadow, he was the light, and anyone who tried to extinguish him was treated as a villain. For the first time, the public, and perhaps the audience watching this unfold, had to ask a chilling question. If a man does so much good with blood money, is he still the bad guy? Or is he simply the only one capable of keeping the city from falling apart? Alessandro De Luca didn't need to hunt Danielle himself. He had a city's worth of debt and devotion to do it for him. To the world, he was the hero of the story, and Danielle was merely the woman trying to tear down the man who kept the lights on. In the quiet elegance of his penthouse, sipping a vintage Barolo while watching the news of the tragic accident on the highway, Alessandro didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man who was deeply, truly disappointed that someone he admired had forced his hand. The 48 hours leading up to the trial were a masterclass in tactical silence. Outside the federal courthouse, the world was a cacophony of media trucks and protesters, but inside the secure facility where Danielle was being held, the air was unnervingly still. Then, at dawn on the day of her testimony, the silence was broken by a frantic series of phone calls. Federal agents burst into the safe house, their faces a mixture of confusion and cautious relief. The news they brought seemed like a miracle. Alessandro De Luca was gone. When the FBI tactical teams had moved in to execute a pre-trial warrant at his Gold Coast estate, they found the gates wide open and the breakfast table still set, but the ghost of Chicago had finally lived up to his name. Satellite tracking and frantic intelligence reports suggested a private jet had departed from a small executive airport in the middle of the night, heading toward the Mediterranean. The consensus among the Bureau's top brass was unanimous. De Luca had finally folded. Facing the insurmountable weight of the death ledger, the philanthropist had chosen exile over a life sentence in a supermax prison. The FBI believed he was halfway to Sicily, retreating to a fortified villa where the reach of American law ended. For the first time in months, the agents guarding Danielle lowered their weapons. They offered her a glass of water and a small, triumphant smile. They told her the monster had run. This was the shift that changed everything. The heavy, suffocating dread that had sat on Danielle's chest since the night of the highway accident began to lift. She was told she was safe, that her testimony was now merely a formality to seize his domestic assets and ensure he could never return to American soil. The high-level security detail was thinned out. The atmosphere in the transport van on the way to the courthouse was almost celebratory. Danielle looked out at the city streets, no longer seeing a maze of potential snipers, but a home she might actually get to live in again. She felt a surge of misplaced courage, believing that her words had been enough to scare the devil back into the shadows. As she walked through the underground tunnels of the courthouse, the lead agent patted her on the shoulder, his voice light. He told her to take a deep breath and just tell the truth, promising her that by the time she walked out of those doors, the name De Luca would be nothing more than a dark chapter in a history book. Danielle believed him. She walked toward the witness stand with her head held high, convinced that she was testifying against a man who was thousands of miles away, hiding in a cave of his own making. She didn't know that the empty house hadn't been an escape. It had been a clearance of the stage. She was stepping into a trap built of false security, and the most dangerous moment of her life wasn't behind her. It was waiting just behind the heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom. The transition from the sterile, protected hallway into the vast expanse of Courtroom 4B felt like stepping into a vacuum. Danielle took her seat in the witness box, the oak railing cool beneath her trembling fingers. The prosecutor gave her a reassuring nod, his voice echoing with a confidence born of the belief that their antagonist was currently crossing the Atlantic. The room was packed with the heavy hitters of the city's press and legal elite, yet the atmosphere was strangely light, as if the collective weight of a decade of fear had been lifted by the news of the flight to Sicily. Danielle cleared her throat, adjusted the microphone, and prepared to utter the first of many truths that would dismantle a legacy. Then the world stopped. It wasn't a loud noise. There was no shouting, no frantic scramble of security, no dramatic burst of gunfire. Instead, it was the sound of a single, heavy latch clicking open at the back of the room. The air in the courtroom, previously stagnant and warm, suddenly turned ice cold, as if a tomb had been unsealed. A silence so absolute gripped the gallery that the sound of the back doors swinging on their hinges felt like a thunderclap. The scent arrived before the man did. It was the smell of expensive, hand-pressed linen and a faint, sharp hint of sandalwood, a fragrance that had haunted Danielle's nightmares since she first stepped foot in that Cicero office. The prosecutor froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open as his gaze drifted toward the rear of the room. The judge's gavel remained poised in midair, suspended by a shock so profound it seemed to paralyze the entire judicial machine. Alessandro De Luca did not hurry. He stepped into the light of the courtroom with the measured, rhythmic pace of a king entering his own throne room. He wore a charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the dim light, his presence commanding a gravity that pulled every eye in the room toward him. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at the stunned judge or the pale-faced marshals who had been told he was thousands of miles away. He looked only at her. The moment was an exact mirror of the terror Danielle had tried to outrun. As he walked down the center aisle, the crowd parted like a dark sea. He came to a halt just a few feet from the witness stand, leaning against the mahogany rail with a casual elegance that was more terrifying than any threat. The man in her image, the cold, unyielding force of nature, was now standing in the flesh. His eyes were not filled with rage. They were filled with a terrifying, predatory calm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The message was written in the slight, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. He wanted her to see him. He wanted her to know that there was no ocean wide enough, no safe house secure enough, and no law powerful enough to keep him from her. The false sense of security shattered like glass, leaving Danielle exposed and gasping for air. She was no longer testifying against a memory in Sicily. She was staring into the eyes of the man who owned the very air she was breathing. The trial hadn't been an end. It was a confrontation, and as Alessandro sat in the front row, never breaking eye contact, Danielle realized she wasn't just a witness. She was a target that had finally been cornered. The air in the courtroom had grown heavy, thick with a tension that felt physical, but the true assault was silent. Alessandro De Luca did not shout. He did not disrupt the proceedings with outbursts or legal theatrics. He simply sat in the front row, his posture relaxed, a predator watching its prey from a distance that was far too close for comfort. As the prosecutor resumed his questioning, trying to regain the momentum lost to De Luca's sudden appearance, Danielle found that her voice, the voice that had been so steady moments ago, was beginning to fail her. The torture began in the margins of the trial. Every time Danielle looked down to consult the documents in front of her, she would catch a movement in her peripheral vision. De Luca was leaning forward, his eyes locked onto hers with a piercing intensity. When she looked up, his lips would move. It was subtle, so slight that a camera or a distracted juror would have missed it entirely. But to Danielle, it was as loud as a scream. He wasn't mouthing threats of violence. He was mouthing names. Marcus. Her brother's name hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled over a sentence, a simple explanation of a wire transfer dissolving into a series of stammers. The prosecutor glanced back at her, a flicker of concern crossing his face. Danielle took a sharp breath, trying to refocus on the ledger, but De Luca was relentless. Elena, her sister. Then, the name of the street where her mother lived. Each syllable was formed with agonizing slow precision, a rhythmic, silent cadence that told her exactly what the price of her truth would be. He was showing her that while he sat in this room, his reach still extended to every corner of her world. He was reminding her that a guilty verdict wouldn't just be a sentence for him. It would be a sentence for everyone she loved. The psychological weight of the game began to tear at her composure. The numbers on the page before her, once so clear and logical, began to swim. She fumbled her words, her testimony becoming erratic and disjointed. To the jury, she was beginning to look like an unreliable witness, a woman cracking under the pressure of the spotlight. To the prosecutor, she looked like a disaster in the making. He stepped closer to the stand, trying to shield her view of the front row, but De Luca merely tilted his head, finding the gap, his eyes never wavering. "Ms. Brooks," the prosecutor prompted, his voice laced with an edge of desperation. "Can you confirm the origin of the $3 million payment?" Danielle opened her mouth, but her throat felt like it was filled with glass. She looked at De Luca. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was simply waiting. He had turned the federal courtroom into a private cage, and with every silent name he uttered, he was closing the bars. The golden goose of the FBI was beginning to shatter, and as her hands began to shake uncontrollably against the wood of the witness stand, the ghost of Chicago sat back, satisfied that the only evidence that mattered was the fear he could manufacture with a single, silent breath. The shift from the prosecutor's frantic rescue attempt to the defense's cross-examination was like watching a predator hand a baton to a surgeon. As De Luca's lead counsel, a man with a silver tongue and a reputation for dismantling the indestructible, stood up, the atmosphere in the room changed from intimidation to a calculated, clinical assassination of character. Alessandro remained in his seat, his eyes still fixed on Danielle, but he leaned back now, a spectator watching a play he had written himself. The trap didn't spring all at once. It began with soft, respectful questions about her credentials and her history with the firm. But then, the lawyer pulled a weathered, yellowing document from a blue folder, and the air in the room seemed to thin. He didn't ask her about the death ledger or the $3 million wire transfers. Instead, he asked her about her father. He asked about a small, struggling dry-cleaning business on the South Side that had miraculously avoided bankruptcy 20 years ago despite a series of devastating gambling debts. "Ms. Brooks," the lawyer's voice was like velvet over a blade, "isn't it true that your father owed a debt that no bank would cover? A debt that was quietly wiped clean by a private benefactor connected to the very organization you are now testifying against?" The question hit Danielle with more force than any silent threat De Luca had mouthed. She felt the blood drain from her face as the lawyer presented evidence of a silent partnership, a pact made in the shadows of her childhood that she had never known existed. The defense wasn't just questioning her memory, they were questioning her motive. They suggested that her discovery of the ledger wasn't a fluke of forensic accounting, but a calculated betrayal. A daughter trying to erase her family's shame by biting the hand that had kept her father out of a shallow grave. The conflict was immediate and devastating. She tried to protest, to explain that she had known nothing of her father's dealings, but the lawyer moved faster. He produced a series of old bank records, showing that her Ivy League education had been funded by accounts that shared the same offshore origin as the shell companies she had flagged. In the eyes of the jury, the golden goose was starting to look like a plant. The narrative shifted from a brave whistleblower to a compromised insider with a personal vendetta. Danielle looked toward the jury box and saw the change. The sympathy that had been there during her earlier testimony was replaced by a cold, skeptical distance. They whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between her and the calm, philanthropic figure of Alessandro De Luca. It was the ghost's ultimate move. He didn't have to prove he was innocent. He only had to prove that she was just as dirty as the world she was trying to expose. As the judge called for a brief recess, Danielle realized with a sinking horror that the truth was no longer enough. The architecture of the lie was too perfect, the trap was too deep, and it looked like the ghost was going to walk out of the courtroom a free man, while she was left buried under the ruins of her own father's secrets. The recess was a blur of cold, fluorescent lights and the panicked whispers of federal agents who suddenly looked like they were guarding a corpse. Danielle sat in the small witness room, staring at the scarred surface of a metal table, realizing that the FBI's protection was an illusion built on paper. They had brought her to the ledge, but they had no wings to give her when the defense pushed. The ghost was winning because he played a game where the rules were written in blood, and the government was still trying to fight him with ink. If she was going to survive the day, if her family was going to survive the night, she had to stop being a witness and start being a weapon. When the bailiff called the court back to order, a heavy air of finality hung over the room. Alessandro De Luca sat with his hands folded, the picture of a misunderstood saint who had just been vindicated. The defense attorney stood with a smirk, ready to deliver the final blow to her credibility. But as Danielle stepped back into the box, the trembling in her hands had stopped. Her eyes didn't seek out the prosecutor or the judge. She looked directly at the front row, meeting De Luca's predatory gaze with a coldness that seemed to catch him off guard. "Ms. Brooks," the defense lawyer began, his tone dripping with patronizing pity, "is there anything else you'd like to discover for us before we conclude?" "Actually," Danielle's voice rang out, amplified by the microphone and a sudden ironclad resolve, "there is." She reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small, unassuming digital recorder. The prosecutor jumped to his feet, shouting an objection about undisclosed evidence, but Danielle didn't look at him. She looked at De Luca. For the first time, the subtle curve of his lips straightened. "I didn't just find a ledger," she said, her voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the gallery. "I knew that in a city where you own the police and the politicians, a book of numbers wouldn't be enough to stop you. You think I'm an accidental witness. I spent 6 months as your accountant. I knew exactly which table you sat at every Tuesday night at Il Tramonto. I knew which waiter was too tired to notice a small, high-frequency bug hidden under the mahogany trim of your favorite booth." The silence that followed was different than before. It was the silence of a fuse burning down. She pressed the play button. The audio was grainy at first, filled with the clinking of silverware and the low hum of a crowded restaurant. But then, a voice emerged, unmistakable, cultured, and terrifyingly calm. It was Alessandro De Luca. He wasn't talking about charity or construction. He was giving an order. "Senator Vance is becoming an expensive nuisance," the recording played. "Make sure the accident on the Eisenhower Expressway happens before the vote on Friday. I want it clean, but I want it public. People need to remember what happens when they forget who funded their campaign." The courtroom didn't just gasp, it erupted. The judge hammered the gavel with a fury that went ignored. The marshals, previously sluggish, moved instinctively toward the front row. Danielle watched as the ghost finally lost his haunt. The mask of the philanthropist shattered in real time, replaced by a raw, jagged snarl of pure rage. For the first time, the predator wasn't watching the prey. He was watching his own empire collapse into the dust. Danielle didn't look away. She held the recorder high, the small device humming with the power of the truth he couldn't buy, while the man who owned the city realized he no longer owned the room. The weeks that followed the revelation of the recording felt like a fevered dream, a blur of motion and steel. The city of Chicago seemed to vibrate with the shock of the ghost's fall, and when the day of the verdict finally arrived, the air outside the courthouse was thick with a tension that felt like an impending storm. Inside, the courtroom was a fortress. Snipers watched from the rooftops and federal marshals stood shoulder to shoulder, their hands never straying far from their holsters. In the center of the storm sat Danielle, her face a mask of exhausted resolve, and Alessandro De Luca, whose terrifying calm had returned, though it was now edged with the cold finality of a man who knew the exit was blocked. The jury returned with a speed that spoke of an undeniable truth. When the foreman stood, the silence in the room was so profound that the rustle of the paper in his hands sounded like a landslide. One word was repeated, count after count, echoing off the mahogany walls like a tolling bell. Guilty. The reaction was not an explosion, but a collective exhale. The prosecutor slumped in his seat, the weight of a decade-long crusade finally lifting. But Danielle didn't feel the rush of victory. She felt only a heavy, hollow stillness. She watched the man in the charcoal suit, waiting for the outburst, the snarl, or the collapse. It never came. Alessandro De Luca received the news of his life sentence with the same polite, detached interest he might have shown a weather report. As the judge ordered the marshals to take the defendant into custody, the room shifted into a frantic mechanical motion. But before the handcuffs could be snapped shut, De Luca made a request, a quiet word to the lead marshal that resulted in a momentary, uneasy pause. He was allowed to stand. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the cameras capturing the death of his empire. He turned and began the long walk toward the exit, flanked by 4 armed men. But as he reached the witness table where Danielle sat, he stopped. The marshals tensed, their hands tightening on his arms, but he didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat with a slow, deliberate grace. He pulled out a single, deep red rose. The room held its breath as he leaned over, placing the flower on the table directly in front of Danielle. The velvet petals looked like a splash of blood against the polished wood. He didn't say a word. He simply leaned in close, his face inches from hers, and for a fleeting second, the saint of the streets and the accountant who broke him shared the same air. He looked at her with an expression that was impossible to decipher, a chilling blend of genuine admiration and predatory promise. He straightened his suit, nodded once to her, and continued his walk out of the courtroom. As the heavy doors closed behind him for the last time, Danielle stared down at the rose. It was a symbol of respect for the only person who had ever been smart enough to outplay him, or it was a silent, beautiful vow that his reach would find her long after the prison gates locked. She didn't know which it was, and as she looked up into the flashing lights of the cameras, she realized that while the trial was over, the shadow of Alessandro De Luca would never truly leave her. The legacy of the trial of Alessandro De Luca would be felt long after the sirens faded, and the courthouse doors were locked for the night. For Danielle Brooks, the victory wasn't found in the clink of the handcuffs or the headlines that flooded the morning papers. It was found in the moment her voice stopped shaking. Her story remains a harrowing reminder that true courage isn't the absence of fear, nor is it the bravado of those who have nothing to lose. It is the act of looking your greatest fear directly in the eyes, seeing the threat, feeling the weight of the consequences, and choosing to speak anyway. Danielle proved that even a ghost can be brought into the light if someone is brave enough to hold the torch. But her story also leaves us with a haunting reflection on the nature of power and the price of integrity. Alessandro De Luca ruled not just through violence, but through the complicated loyalty of a city that he both fed and bled. He turned a courtroom into a psychological battlefield, betting everything on the idea that fear would always silence the truth. He nearly won. Now we have to ask you, if you were the one sitting in that witness chair, and the man who held your life in his hands walked through those doors, what would you have done? Would you have finished your testimony to see justice served, or would you have walked out to ensure your own survival? Tell us your loyalty versus survival choice in the comments below. We want to hear how you would have handled the pressure of the ghost of Chicago. This investigation is just one chapter in our Justice Unveiled series, where we pull back the curtain on the most high-stakes legal battles and hidden criminal empires in history. If you want more deep dives into the cases the world tried to forget, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on those notifications. You won't want to miss the shocking evidence we've uncovered for next week's story. Thank you for watching, and remember, the truth only has power if someone is willing to tell it.